Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So it's been a hot minute since we've done any of these videos. Sorry about that. Probably should have done a few of these last week so that we could power through them, but with personal stuff and the exam, I just figured I can't do it. All right, so normally I can do about 10 pages a day or at least in an hour. And I like to not go above that because beyond an hour, my brain is tired and I need a break. But we do have quite a bit of material. I just went over the chapter to see how long each of them were. And we do have 2 chapters to do in a week as opposed to 1 chapter. So that's a weightier week. But it shouldn't be too much of an issue because there's only about 35 pages in chapter 8. The problem is chapter 9. Chapter 9 starts on page 356 and goes all the way to 3 or 410, 411, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 411. So that's about what? 44 plus 11, 55 pages. That's a lot. That would take me, even if I'm powering through it, about 5 days. So if we have 8 days until the quiz closes, that leaves us with a very narrow margin of time to actually be able to take the quiz, and there's no review time. So I'm going to try to do a little bit more every day as opposed to doing 10, 11 pages per day, and see if I can do that. That way I can give each of you who are following this a little bit more buffer time to actually study beforehand. So it's not just I read and then I take the quiz. It's I read and then I have time to go over my notes. So yeah, without further ado, since we have so little time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right, so chapter 8 is all about group processes. It's broken down from fundamentals of a group, like key features, definitions, that kind of thing. And then they go on to individuals, in groups, the presence of others, group performance, problems and solutions, conflict, cooperation, and competition within and between groups. And then they have the little review at the end. I'm going to try to do everything, including a review of each chapter for you guys. So let's get started. All right. So on the first page of chapter 8, they have these common sense questions, true or false questions. And I've noticed that on the exams, he has sometimes rephrased some of these questions, whether he does it or Cengage does it and he uses the question or not. The point is there are some of these questions that end up on the quiz bank. So I would at least take a look at them. But yeah, okay, so the next thing is they talk about July 20th, 2019, events all over the world celebrated the 50th anniversary of one of the most remarkable achievements in history, the landing of 2 men on the moon. When US President John F. Kennedy announced in May 1961 the goal of achieving this feat before the end of the 1960s, it seemed wildly unrealistic. Also, fun fact, the first Star Trek came out in the 60s. And even though it got canceled, only had 3 seasons, it kind of started this whole obsession and love with getting to space and what it would be like if that was a commonality. And now we have, things like flip phones and computers that talk back to us like they did. And there's so much technology that is straight out of Star Trek. Anyway, that's me digressing. Anyway, It was only 6 years later that the world was stunned by the Soviet Union's technological feat of launching a satellite the size of a beach ball into low Earth orbit. Sputnik, I think it was. Okay, so how could anyone expect that in just 8 years after Kennedy's announcement, when the brand new American space program had not even been able to launch a man into orbit around the Earth, that they would get men all the way to the moon and back? And yet, against incredible odds, with a computer whose power would be dwarfed by the phone in your pocket, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. They were by no means the only heroes of the day. The historic scientific and engineering feat required about 400,000 people working tirelessly and with precise coordination together on a common mission. This is what groups can do at their best. While extraordinarily impressive, it may not seem surprising that this super intelligent, hardworking group of people at NASA could accomplish great things. After all, they really were rocket scientists. But history and social psychology teach us that groups of even super smart people can make really bad decisions. And there is something about the dynamics of groups that can make this happen. For example, two of the biggest tragedies in NASA's history, the explosions of the space shuttles Challenger and Columbia in 1986 and 2003, respectively, occurred in no small part because of bad group processes involving factors such as poor communication, biased sampling of information, and pressure toward conformity. I think that's critical. I think that whole section where they talk about Challenger is key. This, unfortunately, is also what groups can do. I think, but history and social psychology teach us that groups of even smart people can make really bad decisions, and that it has something to do with the dynamics of the group. All right, in short, people are often at their best and their worst in groups. Oh, dang. Sometimes you have to get to the next paragraph to see that there is a short and sweet, simplified way of saying something. Yeah, I think I'm going to highlight that. People are often at their best and worst in groups. It is through groups that individuals form communities, pool resources, and share successes. But it is also through groups that ideas stagnate in endless discussion. Selfish impulses flourish in the anonymity of a crowd, and prejudices turn into genocide and war. Clearly, it is important that we understand how groups work and how individuals influence and are influenced by groups. In this chapter, we first introduce the fundamentals of what groups are and how they developed. Then, we examine groups on several levels. At the individual level, we explore how individuals are influenced by groups. At the group level, we explore how groups perform. And at the intergroup level, we explore how groups interact with each other in cooperation and competition. The research we report in this chapter reveals a fascinating fact. Groups can be quite different from the sum of their parts. When you think about what that statement, it suggests something almost mystical or magical about groups. How can a group be better or worse than its individual members? The math may not seem to add up, but the theory and research discussed in this chapter will help answer that question. Okay, so fundamentals of a group. We begin our exploration of groups by asking the basic question: what is a group? Why do people join groups? And then we focus on three important aspects of groups: roles, norms, and cohesiveness. So a group There's the definition right on the side. It's a key term. I would highlight it. What is a group? The question might seem quite simple, but if you step back and think about it, the answer is less obvious. For example, you may belong to a variety of groups on social media. Are these really groups? You may be part of a large social psychology class. Is this a group identity that is meaningful to you? A group may be characterized as a set of individuals who have direct interactions with each other over a period of time and share a common fate, identity, or set of goals. A group can also consist of people who have joint membership in a social category based on sex, race, or other attributes. This characteristic is especially relevant for the issues discussed in Chapter 5 on stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So I'm going to highlight just until that semicolon. The group can also consist of people who have joint membership of social categories based on sex, race, or other attributes. Okay, so groups vary in the extent to which they are seen as distinct entities, such as whether they have rigid boundaries that make them distinct from other groups. In other words, some groups seem more groupy. Or, in the unfortunate choice of word used by researchers on this issue, intitiative? I have no idea what that means. It looks like entitle and quantitative or qualitative. Had a baby. I don't know how to say that word. I'm going to highlight groups vary in the extent to which they seem as distinct entities. All right, so some groups seem more groupy than others. On the very low end of this dimension would be people attending a concert or working out near each other at a gym. That makes sense. These typically are not considered real groups. They're just people who went to the same places. Such assemblages are sometimes called collectives, people engaging in a common activity but having little direct interaction with each other. All right, I think I'm going to highlight that. That also looks like a key term. Okay, much more integrated groups include tight-knit clubs, sports teams, or work teams, groups that engage in very purposeful activities with a lot of interaction over time and clear boundaries of who is in and who is not in the group. I think I'm going to say integrated groups and then that definition, groups that engage. Okay, so people tend to identify strongly with these more integrated groups or coherent groups and to get more satisfaction from them. I don't know if integrated or coherent would be a better defining term for it, but I'm going to underline that. So Scott Gruppenberger and others in 2019 recently found, for example, that the more that members of a fitness class felt their class was a real group, the more they reported exercising harder and enjoying their workouts. Yeah, I can relate to that. I've enjoyed my Zumba classes when I know the people that are in them, or like a yoga class, or even rock climbing. I've enjoyed it much more when I know the people around me and we have a set schedule of when we hang out and do that. That makes sense. Okay, so why join a group? So we talked about what groups are. So now why to join them? The complexity and ambitions of human life require that we work in groups. Much of what we hope to produce and accomplish can be done only through collective action. Lone individuals cannot play symphonies or football games, build cities or industries, or run governments or universities. Yeah, I think the super rich need to remember that they cannot build their massive billion-dollar empires without the people they exploit. Sorry, that's a little political. Anyway, at a more fundamental level, humans have an innate need to belong to groups stemming from evolutionary pressures that increase people's chances of survival and reproduction if they live in groups rather than in isolation. I think I'm going to highlight that. Humans have an innate need all the way to live in groups rather than in isolation. Okay, so our ancestors would have been easy snacks for the predators on the savannah in our ancient past if they wandered alone. Although their role in physical protection may not be as paramount today, being part of groups remains essential for humans, as is discussed in Chapter 5 concerning social identity theory. An important part of people's feelings of self-worth comes from their identification with particular groups. Groups often give us meaning and purpose, and according to some scholars, perhaps even a symbolic sense of immortality, as our most cherished groups live on beyond our lifetimes. These aspects of group membership are at the root of why being rejected by a group is one of life's most painful experiences. Okay, so I think I'm going to highlight that sentence, and I think I'm going to highlight groups often give us meaning and purpose, and perhaps even a symbolic sense of immortality. All right, so key features of groups: roles, norms, and cohesiveness. So they're going to introduce those three concepts and then get to them. Once an individual has joined a group, a process of adjustment takes place as the individual is socialized to how things work in the group. This socialization process may be formal and implicit, such as through mentoring or supervision, or that's explicit, or it may be implicit as newcomers observe how established members behave in the group. Effectively, socializing new members can produce important benefits for the group as a whole. Okay, so I'm going to highlight those two ways that people enter. A process of adjustment takes place as the individuals are socialized. And then there's formal and implicit. No, just implicit, I think. And implicit. I think those two examples will be good to put underneath when I type up my notes. Okay, so 3 of the things that are especially important for newcomers. Is it just me or did it get really dark really fast? Hold on. Let me turn on this light. Okay. Let's see if my neighbor starts fighting me for the fan to be on. Okay. So 3 of the things that are especially important for newcomers to learn are the roles they are expected to play in the group. We focus on each of these 3 features of groups in the following sections. Roles. People's roles in a group, their set of expected behaviors can be formal or informal. I'm going to highlight that. Formal roles are designated by titles: teacher, student in a class, vice president or account executive at a corporation, big brother, little brother in fraternities. Captain of the intramural team. That makes sense. Okay, so informal roles are less obvious, but still powerful. Robert Bales in 1958 distinguished between 2 fundamental types of roles: an instrumental role to help the group achieve its tasks, and an expressive role to provide emotional support and maintain morale. The same person can fill both roles, but often they are assumed by different individuals, and which of these roles is emphasized in groups may fluctuate over time depending on the needs of the group. Okay, so a lot of that is important. I think we could make notes about almost all of it. So we have informal rules are designated by titles, and there's examples. There's informal rules are less obvious. Then there's instrumental role and its definition, expressive role and its definition. This is a really jam-packed paragraph. And then the same person can fill both roles, but often they're assumed by different individuals. And emphasis of these roles may fluctuate over time depending on the needs of the group. Yeah, that whole paragraph is pretty crucial. Okay, so one problem that can seriously harm the performance of groups is when there is a mismatch between members' skills and what roles they occupy in the group. It is far too common in groups for members to be assigned or take on roles, group roles, in a way that is less than thoughtful and systematic. Members may be assigned roles simply based on who is available at a given point in time, rather than who is best suited for the role. Groups function much better when members are assigned roles that match their talents and personalities, and social psychologists are among the consultants often hired to help groups do this better. I'm going to highlight groups function better. Yeah, I think that's the most critical line in there. All right, so group members sometimes find themselves uncertain about what their role is supposed to be, or they may be placed in roles that conflict with other roles they have to play, either within the group, such as needing to be demanding while also being the source of emotional support. That can be challenging. Or between groups, such as what you are required to do for work and what you're required to do for your family. Role uncertainty, instability, and conflict are all associated with poor job performance, as well as a variety of other problems, including workplace bullying, other interpersonal conflicts, emotional exhaustion and burnout, and high turnover. I think I'm going to highlight that sentence. I think that's more important than the first one. It's got more meat. All right, so we've talked about roles. Now we're going to talk about norms. In addition to roles for its members, groups also establish norms or rules of conduct for their members. Yep, that's getting highlighted. Groups also establish norms. Okay. Like rules, norms may be either formal or informal. Fraternities and sororities, for example, often have written rules for the behavior expected for their members. That's an example. I'm going to highlight the norms may be either formal or informal. If you want to tag that example so that you can easily remember, then yeah. But that one's definitely a formal example of norms. Informal norms are more subtle. What do I wear? How hard can I push for what I want? Who pays for this or that? What kind of language, joking, or socializing is typical for this group? These norms provide individuals with a sense of what it means to be a good group member. Figuring out the unwritten rules of a group can take time and cause anxiety because it's not easily or readily defined for you. Yeah, I think I'm going to highlight that last sentence, as informal norms are more subtle. Yeah, okay. So groups often exert strong conformity pressures on individuals who deviate from group norms. On one way that low status or new group members may try to establish a stronger position in the group is to be especially punishing of members who break group norms, especially if high status group members would witness their harsh reaction to norm violators. So an easy way to get into a group, even though you don't have much ranking or much time in that group, is to call out hypocrisy within it, specifically when it's going to get called out in front of someone with a high position of authority in that group. That makes sense. I may highlight that, but I'm going to wait to see. Okay, so on the other hand, group members who care about the group's success may engage in loyal deviance. Yeah, loyal deviance, and defy a group norm if they think the norm is bad for the group. How tolerant groups are to violations of norms can be itself a kind of norm. Some groups, for example, pride themselves on how heterogeneous and free-thinking its members are. Others strongly value uniformity. Indeed, when a group has a strong norm of encouraging diverse viewpoints, it can cause members to conform to the norm of not conforming. They just basically said the same thing again. Ugh. I'm going to highlight the first sentence. How tolerant groups are of violations can be a norm in of itself. And then I think I am going to highlight the first sentence of the last paragraph. Exert strong conformity pressures on individuals who deviate from the group. I don't know about that high status group. I'm going to have to think about that for a minute. All right, so cohesiveness. No, you know what? I don't. I want to highlight it. So I'm gonna. Okay, all right, so cohesiveness is the last one in this section. Groups whose members share similar attitudes and closely follow the group's norms are more likely than other groups to be cohesive. Group cohesiveness, key term, highlight, very important, refers to the forces exerted on a group that push its members closer together. Members of cohesive groups tend to feel commitment to the group task, feel positively towards the other group members, feel group pride, and engage in many, and often intense, interactions in the group. An interesting question is whether cohesiveness makes groups perform better. It may seem obvious that it should. Indeed, groups often strive to achieve cohesiveness, and they may take steps to enhance it, such as ordering everyone to go through bonding exercises or hang out together at a rustic retreat. In fact, however, the relationship between cohesiveness and performance is not a simple one. The causal relationship works both ways. On the one hand, when a group is cohesive, group performance often improves. On the other hand, when a group performs well, it often becomes more cohesive. Many team athletes recognize that winning creates team chemistry even more than team chemistry creates winning. I think that might be something that is used on the test or one of the quizzes. Yeah, the causal relationship works both ways, I think is important. And groups often strive to achieve cohesiveness. So, whatever the cause and effect, several longitudinal studies and meta-analyses of hundreds of studies have provided evidence showing that group cohesion is associated with better performance. Other variables tend to be important in predicting when and to what extent these relationships emerges, however, such as how large the group is, whether the cohesiveness is primarily about the group's attraction to the task or task cohesion, or to each other, interpersonal cohesion. Okay, that sounds important. Whether the cohesiveness all the way to interpersonal. Cohesion. Okay, and what type of task the group performs. So I think I'm going to highlight whatever the cause sentence, that first sentence. Yeah. And the last sentence is, as we will see a bit later in the chapter, group cohesiveness can also lead to conformity and narrow-mindedness that cause major problems for groups. That is important. Group cohesiveness can also lead. It's important to see both of them. All right, so culture and group norms and cohesiveness. It's its own little section to finish off this whole fundamentals of a group section. Cultures vary in how much they tolerate behavior that deviates from the norm. Anthropologist Pertipello, I don't know, in 1968 first described the difference between tight and loose cultures. He proposed that tight cultures have strong norms and little tolerance for behavior that deviates from the norm, while loose cultures are relatively weaker norms and greater tolerance for deviant behavior. I'm going to put the little note because guaranteed that study is going to be on something. All right, so Efticia, Stamko, and others in 2019 presented participants in 19 countries with a scenario involving either norm-violating behavior, like they caused some commotion while getting a cup of coffee during a meeting and interrupted a colleague to express their opinion, or stated rules are there to be broken, or they exhibited norm-following behavior, like they waited to get coffee, waited to state their opinion, stated rules are there for a reason, that kind of thing. Participants from tighter countries showed stronger support for the norm followers than did the participants from looser countries. Yeah, I have a feeling those two are going to be important, particularly because there's a figure for it right here. Yeah, I'm going to put a little demarcation so that I can put this in my notes. All right, so researchers also found that countries with a greater degree of collectivism, emphasizing interdependence, cooperation, and social harmony, rather than the individualism, emphasizing independence, autonomy, self-reliance, reacted to norm-violating behavior with stronger moral outrage. Well, duh. Yeah. Cultures also differ in how they value and perceive cohesiveness. For example, cohesiveness in collectivist cultures is associated more with social harmony, cooperation, interpersonal relations than in individualistic cultures, where recognizing members' unique skills, perspectives, and job-focused efforts is more essential for group cohesiveness. The extent to which groups are comfortable, I don't know why I said that so weird, comfortable with conflict and heated debate among their members also varies across culture. Generally, individualistic cultures prefer dominating styles to resolve conflict, whereas collectivistic cultures prefer compromising, cooperative styles, or avoiding conflict altogether. Yeah, those are 3 different studies. I think they're all going to be pretty important. Yeah. Okay, so the individual in groups, the presence of others. So when we engage in activities in groups, we are in the presence, either physically or virtually, of others. It's an obvious point, but some of its consequences are profound and surprising. In this section, we focus on the 3 important effects that the presence of others can have on individuals, either social facilitation, social loafing, or de-individuation. So in social facilitation, we're talking about when others arouse us. So social psychologists have long been fascinated by how the presence of others affect behavior. In chapter 1, we reported that Norman Triplett's article on the dynamogenic factors of pacemaking and competition in 1897 in 1898 is often cited as the earliest publication in the field. Triplett began his research by studying the official bicycle records from the Racing Board of the League of American Wheelmen in the 1897 season. Perhaps, like some of you avid readers of the American Wheelman records, yeah, right, Triplett noticed that cyclists who competed against others performed better than those who cycled alone against the clock. After dismissing various theories of the day, our favorite is brain worry. He proposed his own hypothesis that the presence of another rider releases the competitive instinct, which increases nervous energy and enhances performance. To test this proposition, Triplett got 40 children to wind up fishing reels, alternating between performing alone and working in parallel. Triplett reported that children were more likely to perform better when they worked side by side than when they worked alone. Yeah, I have a feeling he's going to make that important. In a contemporary twist on this classic, Michael Strube in 2005 used modern statistical techniques to reanalyze his original data, Triplett's original data, not Straub's, or Strube's, whatever, however you pronounce his name, to reanalyze Triplett's original data and found that the results were quite weak and not as straightforward as Triplett's report had suggested. Later research following Triplett's studies proved mixed. Sometimes the presence of others, side by side or with an audience out front, enhanced performance. At other times, performance declined. It seemed that Triplett's promising lead had turned into a blind alley, and social psychologists had largely abandoned this research by World War II. But years later, Robert Zajonc in 1965 and 1980 saw a way to reconcile the contradictory results by integrating research from experimental psychology with social psychological research. Zajonc is pronounced to rhyme with science. I don't know. They've got a parentheses there. Anyway, Zajonc offered an elegant solution. The presence of others increases arousal, which can affect performance in different ways depending on the task at hand. So let's see how that works. So before we go into Zajonc's solution, I have a feeling I'm saying that wrong. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm going to highlight social psychologists have long been fascinated by how the presence of others affect behavior. And I'm going to highlight the presence of others increases arousal, the last sentence, which can affect performance in different ways depending on the task at hand of that section. Okay, so they're going to talk about Zajonc's solution. So he proposed a 3-step process. 1, the presence of others creates general physiological arousal, which energizes behavior. Based on experimental psychology research and principles of evolution, Zajonc argued that all animals, including humans, tend to become aroused when in the presence of conspecifics, that is, members of their own species. I think I'm going to highlight that. All animals, including humans, and that definition with its definition. All right, so the second one. Increased arousal enhances an individual's tendency to perform the dominant response. The dominant response is the reaction elicited most quickly and easily by a given stimulus. All right, so I'm going to highlight dominant response and its definition. And third, the quality of an individual's performance varies according to the type of task. On an easy task, one that is simple or well learned, the dominant response is usually correct or successful. But on a difficult task, one that is complex or unfamiliar, the dominant response is often incorrect or unsuccessful. So easy task, correct or successful. Difficult task, incorrect or unsuccessful. All right, so those are the 3-step process proposed by Zhejiang. So putting these 3 steps together yields the following scenarios shown in figure 8.2. Suppose you're playing the violin. If you're an excellent player and are performing a well-learned, familiar arrangement, having other people around should enhance your performance. The presence of others will increase your arousal, which will enhance your dominant response. Because this arrangement is so well learned, your dominant response will be to perform it well. However, if you're just learning to play the violin and you are unfamiliar with this arrangement, the presence of others is the last thing you'll want. The increase in arousal should enhance the dominant response, which in this case would be unsuccessful violin playing. Interesting. So if you have no skill in doing something and they put you in a competition, you'll do way worse than if you were just alone. But if you are with others in a competitive kind of scenario and you've practiced quite a bit, it tends to charge you with a more dominant response that makes you play better. Interesting. Okay. So taken as a package, these 2 effects of the presence of others, helping performance on easy tasks but hurting performance on difficult tasks, are known as social facilitation, which is a definition. Please highlight it. This sums up the whole thing. Unfortunately, this term has been a prime source of confusion for countless students. The trick is to remember that the presence of others facilitates the dominant response, not necessarily the task itself. I'm gonna highlight that. That's gonna be on everything. Yep. This facilitation of the dominant response doesn't, in effect, facilitate easy tasks, but it makes difficult tasks even more difficult. So Zhejiang proposed this social facilitation is universal, occurring not only in human activities, but also among other animals, even insects. Have you ever wondered, for example, how well a cockroach performs in front of other cockroaches? Neither did we. That is, we didn't until we first learned of Zhejiang's creative research on the topic. He and his colleagues in 1969 had cockroaches placed in a brightly lit start box connected to a darkened goal box. When the track was a simple one, with a straight runway between the start box and the goal box, cockroaches running in pairs ran more quickly toward the goal box than those running alone. But in a more complex maze that required a right turn to reach the goal box, solitary cockroaches outraced pairs. In a particularly creative follow-up experiment, Zhejiang and his colleagues found that cockroaches completed the easy maze faster and the difficult maze slower if they raced in front of a crowd of spectator cockroaches than if they raced with no audience. How did the researchers get cockroaches to participate as spectators? Well, they placed them in plexiglass in audience boxes along either side of the maze, and this audience produced social facilitation. I'm just gonna, that whole study. Lovely and gross at the same time. So, social facilitation today. His formulation revived interest in the issues raised by Triplett's early research, and suddenly, the inconsistent findings that had been reported began to make sense. The results of a meta-analysis of 241 studies were consistent with much of Zhejiang's account. And despite its long history, research today continues to demonstrate new examples of social facilitation and to test its scope and limitations. The settings in which social facilitation effects have been found are quite wide, such as on driving tests. A word of advice: don't take your road test with another test taker present in the car. It doesn't end well. Electronic gambling and visual searches, and the effects have been found even when others present were merely a photograph of a favorite TV character or a computer display of a virtual person. New research points to areas of the brain that appear to be especially implicated in social facilitation effects. And perhaps not surprising, these areas are associated with social judgments and motivations. I'm going to highlight that new research. Yeah, that are associated with social judgments and motivations, because we've had questions like that on the past 2 exams. So I have a feeling that's going to get used. Okay, so it is in part because of the effects of social facilitation that firefighters, police officers, military personnel, and others often practice scenarios repeatedly to the point of seeming to overtrain. But it is only through such repetition that their dominant response in a highly arousing situation is likely to be the correct one. When they are in the midst of a raging fire or a military firefight, it is often impossible for them to think carefully. So it is all the more essential that their dominant response be a good one. It's essentially like the reason why you practice in martial arts the same movements over and over again. It's not just strength training. It's increasing muscle memory, especially if you do things like Krav Maga or anything like that. It's about not having to think very critically and consciously in the moment, in the heat of a situation where you didn't see it coming, or you need to be on. It's if you've practiced all these different techniques, your body will know what to do to get out of that technique if you've practiced it enough. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so alternative explanations for social facilitation. Social facilitation effects have been replicated across many domains, but not all of Zajanc's theory has received universal support. Zajanc proposed that the mere presence of others is sufficient to produce social facilitation. I'm going to highlight that. That's also a key term. Mere presence. All right. Some have argued, however, that a better explanation is the evaluation apprehension theory, another key term, which proposes that performance will be enhanced or impaired only in the presence of others who are in a position to evaluate that performance. In other words, it's not simply because others are around that I'm so aroused and therefore inept as I try to learn to snowboard on a crowded mountain. No. Rather, it's because I worry that the others are watching and probably laughing at me, possibly uploading a video of my performance to YouTube. These concerns increase my dominant response, which unfortunately in this situation is going to be falling. Yeah. Another account of social facilitation is distraction conflict theory, another definition, please highlight. It points out that being distracted while we're working on tasks creates attentional conflict. We're torn between focusing on the task and glancing at the distracting stimulus. When we are conflicted about where to pay attention, our arousal increases. So is one of these theories right and the other is wrong? You know what? I'm going to say something about that because that makes a lot of sense. Personally, as a mother, there are times where you are trying to cook, you need to cook, you've cooked a million times before. It's probably the same dish you've ever made. I don't care if you're making something super fancy or it's super easy, like Kraft mac and cheese and you're just dumping the box in the thing, if you're constantly being distracted by a kid that's trying to vie for your attention, it increases that conflict and arousal and can make it more difficult. So if you're not used to dealing with those distraction and conflict, I can see how that would produce other issues with social facilitation. So I understand why they're making a point to say Zajonc isn't the end-all be-all to social facilitation and that these theories can easily play a role in it. All right, so focus, Michelle, focus. So is one of these theories right and the others wrong? Probably not. It seems likely that all three of the basic elements described by these theories, presence, evaluation, attention, can contribute to the impact others have on our own performance. I'm going to highlight that. All three of these basic elements, all the way to our own performance. But as we're about to see in the next section, there's even more to the story about how individuals are affected by the presence of others. So this next section is called social loafing, when others relax us. Ooh. Okay. Yeah, I've got about 5 more pages to go. I can do it. So in the tasks relevant to social facilitation effects, an individual's behavior can be identified and evaluated, but in some tasks, efforts are pooled so that the specific performance of any one individual cannot be determined. It just so happens that research on these kinds of collective endeavors can also be traced back to Triplet's era of the late 19th century. In chapter 1, we mentioned the French agricultural engineer Max Ringelmann as another contender for having conducted the first social psychology research. In research conducted during the 1880s, Ringelmann discovered that people's output declined when they worked together rather than alone on simple tasks like pulling a rope or pushing a cart. Why did individual output decline? One explanation is that the individuals exerted less effort when they acted collectively. But another explanation is that individuals simply demonstrated poor coordination when working together. Some pulled while others relaxed, and vice versa. How can you distinguish lack of effort from poor coordination in a task like this? Nearly 100 years after Ringelmann's research, Alan Ingham and colleagues in 1974 answered this question by using a rope pulling machine and blindfolding participants. In one condition, participants were led to think that they were pulling with a bunch of other participants. And in another condition, the participants were informed that they were pulling alone, which in fact they were. The researchers told the participants to pull as hard as they could. Ingham and colleagues were able to measure exactly how hard each individual participant pulled, and they observed that the participants pulled almost 20% harder when they thought they were pulling alone than when they thought they were pulling with others. I'm gonna put the little thing right there. That sounds like a critical study. Yeah, Bibb, Latané, and group and colleagues in 1979 found that group-produced reductions in individual output, which they called social loafing. Sorry, I lost my place. Yeah, they found that these group-produced reductions in individual output, which they called social loafing, that's a definition, please highlight, are common in other types of tasks as well. For example, imagine being asked as part of a psychology experiment to cheer or clap as loudly as you can. Common sense might lead you to think that you would cheer and clap louder when doing this together with others in a group than when you're performing it alone, because you would be less embarrassed and inhibited if others are doing the same thing as you. But Latané and colleagues found that when performing collectively, students tended to loaf. They exerted less effort. The noise generated by each individual decreased as the size of the group increased. This social loafing occurred even among cheerleaders, who are supposed to be experts at cheering and clapping with others. Social loafing is not restricted to simple motor tasks. Sharing responsibility with others reduces the amount of effort that people put into more complex motor tasks, such as playing team sports, cognitive tasks, such as completing memory, math, or verbal tests, and important, enduring, real-world behaviors, such as working collaboratively on collective farms or team projects, or overseeing safety protocols at a factory or lab. When others are there to pick up the slack, people slack off. I'm going to highlight that. Most college students are quite familiar with having to work on group projects. If you're in any psychology classes this semester, we're starting to get to the point where group projects are not coming due, but they're starting to come to that point where you really do need to start getting together. Otherwise, you're going to run out of time to work on things. So yeah, this is particularly relevant right now. Not right now, honey. Close the doors. Thank you, honey. Sorry, my kid. Many have seen the pitfalls of social loafing in these settings. Praveen and Agarwal and Connie O'Brien in 2008 studied several hundred college students to assess what factors can reduce the incidence of social loafing. And they offer 3 strategies. 1, limit the scope of the project. Projects that are very large and complex should be broken down into smaller components. Oh, all the highlighting. Factors that can reduce the incidence of loafing. 3 strategies. I'm going to highlight pretty much all of this because it's all important. The second one is to keep the groups small. And 3, to use peer evaluations. Very important. Making each group member a manager of different segments of the task can also help reduce loafing. I'm going to highlight that as well. So businesses have taken note of social loafing and have applied these research findings in an effort to reduce it in the workplace. For example, one form of social loafing at the workplace has come to be known as cyber loafing, which involves personal non-work use of online technology, such as online shopping, watching videos, or messaging friends. My love? My love? Sorry. My love! I'm live. I know, honey. Sorry. This involves personal non-work use of online technology for things such as online shopping, watching videos, messaging friends. It can be a huge drain on workers' productivity. One result is that workers' actions on the job are coming under increasing surveillance as the number of computer keystrokes they make per hour or the content of their calls, emails, or internet browsing can be recorded electronically. Yeah. I have some opinions on that, but I'm not going to get into it. I'm going to highlight cyber loafing and its definition. I think that's probably the biggest thing to get out of that paragraph. So, collective effort model. Several researchers have constructed theoretical accounts to explain the findings about when social loafing is more or less likely to occur. The most influential of these is the collective effort model. Highlight, it is a key term. So, this model asserts that individuals will try hard on a collective task when they think their efforts will help them achieve outcomes they personally value. If the outcome is important to individual members of the group, and if they believe they can achieve the desired outcome, they are less likely to socially loathe. In fact, in these cases, it may even engage in social compensation. Highlight. By increasing their efforts on a collective task to try to compensate for the anticipated social loafing or poor performance of other group members. The next time you work on a group project, such as a paper that you and several other students are supposed to write together, consider the factors that increase and decrease social loafing and try to change aspects of the situation so that all group members are motivated to do their share of the work. Okay, so we have a section called Culture and Social Loafing. So Stephen Carau, that's how a Brazilian would say it, sorry, and Kipling Williams in 1993 conducted a meta-analysis of 78 studies and found that social loafing can be a reliable phenomenon that is evident across numerous tasks and in countries around the world. Despite its prevalence around the world, some gap and cultural differences and tendencies to socially loaf have been found. So their meta-analysis found that social loafing was less prevalent among women than among men, and less prevalent among people from East Asia or collectivist cultures, China, Japan, Taiwan, than among people from Western individualistic cultures, Canada, United States, etc. All right, so I'm going to highlight that. Social loafing is less prevalent all the way to the example of the United States and Canada. So with their tendencies to be more aware of their connections and mutual reliance on others, women and people from collectivistic cultures may be relatively more concerned about the positive negative interpersonal impact of social loafing. If someone in the group does violate a norm of hard work, however, people from collectivistic cultures may take more offense. That is the implication of research by Tseng-Kai Hung and others in 2009, who found that workers in Taiwan who perceived co-workers as socially loafing were likely to be motivated to seek revenge toward their co-workers. I'm going to highlight that study. Or not highlight it, but make a note. In an interesting twist, Yingyi Hong and others in 2008 hypothesized that there are times when people from collectivistic cultures may be especially likely to socially loathe. Interesting. Because people from collectivistic cultures tend to be concerned with behaving consistently with group norms, they may be tempted to socially loathe if they are working in a group that has established a group norm of low productivity and effort. The researchers found support for this idea in a set of studies with Chinese students. When these students engaged in a task with a group of co-workers who were not being productive, the participants reduced their own efforts if they thought their effort would be evident to their co-workers. Not wanting to publicly deviate from the group norm, these students conformed to the norm of working less hard. Yeah, I think I'm also going to make a note of that study as well. Okay, so where are we at? I was trying to get to 329. We're at 326. It's been an hour, but I also talked a bit. I think I'm going to get to 328. There's a good stopping point. So we're just going to go over 2 more quick pages. All right. The last section before we get to group performance is de-individuation. And I think that would be a good stopping point. So we're going to power through this in the next 5 minutes real quick. Being in the presence of others can lead to social facilitation and social loafing, but occasionally the presence of others can lead to extreme actions. A group of sports fans, excited at their home team's victory, spills out of the arena onto the street, and soon a riot develops, complete with small fires, overturned cars, and looting. A conflict between 2 people late at night in a loud dance club suddenly turns into a raucous brawl with bottles flying, punches thrown, involving dozens of people. What turns an unruly crowd into a violent mob? No doubt there are many factors, including imitation of aggressive models, intense frustration, and alcohol consumption. These factors are discussed in chapter 11 on aggression, but there's also de-individuation, the loss of a person's sense of individuality and the reduction of normal constraints against deviant behavior. Highlight, it's a key term. So de-individuation is often a collective phenomenon that occurs in the presence of others. I think I'm going to highlight that. So Zimbardo, we all know Zimbardo. Philip Zimbardo in 1969 observed that arousal, anonymity, and reduced feelings of individual responsibility together contribute to de-individuation. I'm going to highlight that as well. Arousal, anonymity, and the reduced feeling of individual responsibility together contribute to de-individuation. These elements certainly seem to be in play in the destructive behavior that groups of sports fans often exhibit after a big win or loss. For example, immediately after the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl in February of 2018, thousands of rowdy fans took to the streets to celebrate. The celebrations quickly took a destructive turn as cars were overturned, fires set, stores looted, and property destroyed. It is important to note that these fans were not frustrated or angry at a bitter loss. They were happy. So why would they, and the fans of many teams around the world after a big victory, act out destructively? All three elements that Zimbardo specified were present here. The fans were very aroused by their team's victory, and thousands of celebrating fans provided the individuals with relative anonymity because there were thousands of them. The more anonymity you feel, the less you feel hindered by social norms. And these factors, quite probably along with the alcohol consumed during the game, contributed to reduced feelings of individual responsibility for their actions. According to Steve Prentice Dunn and Ronald Rogers in 1982 and 1983, two types of environmental cues, accountability cues and attentional cues, make deviant behaviors such as this rioting more likely to occur. So I'm going to highlight that. Two types of environmental cues make deviant behaviors more likely to occur. All right, so accountability cues. That's a term. I would highlight it and its definition. Accountability cues affect the individual's cost-reward calculations. When accountability is low, those who commit deviant acts are less likely to be caught and punished. And people may deliberately choose to engage in gratifying, but usually inhibited behaviors. Being in a large crowd or wearing a mask are two examples of instances where accountability may be low, and these factors are associated with more extreme and destructive behaviors. Attentional cues, highlight, and its definition, focuses a person's attention away from the self. So in this state, the individual attends less to internal standards of conduct, and they react more in the immediate situation and they're less sensitive to long-term consequences of their behavior. Behavior slips out from the bonds of cognitive control in these situations, and people then act on impulse. I think I'm going to highlight that. That sounds pretty key. When you are at a party with very loud music and flashing lights, you may be swept up with a pulsating crowd and feel your individual identity slipping away. One context ripe for de-individuation is online behavior. If you've ever been part of an online community where people can post comments anonymously, there's a good chance that you've witnessed some of the nasty effects of de-individuation. Many well-intentioned sites or discussions or even the comment sections linked to online newspaper stories, videos, or celebrity gossip blogs soon devolve into a torrent of crude, hostile, and prejudiced venting and taunting that would never happen without the cloak of anonymity. Yeah, that's pretty. I think I'm going to highlight that sentence. The things that people say when they don't feel like you'll ever meet them. So, trick or treat, field experiments on Halloween. One particularly creative set of field experiments by Edward Diner and Arthur Beeman and their colleagues in 1979 and 1976 demonstrated how accountability and attentional cues can affect behavior on a night when many otherwise well-behaved individuals act in antisocial ways. Halloween. Oh, how particularly perfect that we're doing this in October. When you think about it, Halloween is a perfect time to study de-individuation. Children often wear costumes with masks, travel in large groups at night, and are highly aroused. In one study, the researchers unobtrusively observed more than 1,300 children who came trick-or-treating to 27 homes spread around Seattle. At each of these homes, a researcher met and greeted the children who were either alone or in groups. In one condition, the researcher asked the children their names and where they lived. In another condition, the researcher did not ask them any questions about their identities. When asked to identify themselves, the children should have become more self-aware and more accountable for their actions. Children who were not asked to reveal their identities were in a group should have felt relatively de-individuated, safe, and anonymous in their costumes. The children were then invited to take one item from a bowl full of candy and were left alone with the bowl. Hidden observers watched to see how many pieces of candy each child took. What did the observers see? Children who were in a group were more likely to break the rule and take extra candy than the children who were alone. Add anonymity to the presence of a group, and children were even more likely to do so. In other words, children were more likely to take extra candy when they were in the most de-individuated situation, when they were in a group and had not been asked to identify themselves. In another experiment, the researchers placed a mirror behind the candy bowl in some conditions. The presence of a mirror tends to increase people's self-awareness. Children who had been asked their names, especially older children, were much less likely to steal candy if there was a mirror present than if there wasn't. Older children are more likely to have internal standards against stealing, and making these children self-aware made them more likely to act according to those standards. Yeah, I think I'm just going to put a little for this specific study, especially since it has a little figure next to it, 8.4. Okay, so the last little section before we're done today, moving from personal to social identity. The loss of personal identity does not always produce antisocial behavior. In a study conducted by Robert Johnson and Leslie Downing in 1979, female undergraduates donned garments resembling either robes associated with the Ku Klux Klan, a very racist hate group, or nurses' uniforms. Half of the participants were individually identified throughout the study. The others were not. All the participants were then given the opportunity to increase or decrease the intensity of electric shocks delivered to a supposed other participant. It was actually a Confederate in the experiment, who had previously behaved in an obnoxious manner. Participants wearing Ku Klux Klan costumes increased shock levels in both identified and anonymous conditions. However, among those in nurses' apparel, anonymous participants decreased shock intensity 4 times more frequently than did identified participants. These findings support the social identity model of de-individuation effects, also known as SIDE. I would highlight it. It is a key term, very important. This social identity model proposes that whether de-individuation affects people for better or worse reflects the characteristics and norms of the group immediately surrounding the individual, as well as the group's power to act according to these norms. As personal identity and internal controls are submerged, social identity emerges and conformity to the group increases. If a group defines itself in terms of prejudice and hatred against another group, for an example, de-individuation can ignite an explosion of violence. But if the group defines itself in terms of helping others, in contrast, de-individuation may promote pro-social or selfless actions. The consequences of losing your personal identity, therefore, depend on what you lose it to. I'm going to highlight that. All right, I'm going to take a break because my kids are hungry and tired. All right. Thanks for staying with me a little bit longer. I know I took some time in between there to deal with crying kids and lights and everything like that. So thank you for staying on. If anybody has any questions, who's watching this later, feel free to just message me. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.